Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the second paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being True War First Appears in the Art of Sieges. The text follows. In the art of sieges, we first perceive a certain degree of guidance of the combat, something of the action of the intellectual faculties upon the material forces placed under their control, but generally only so far that it very soon embodied itself again in new material forms, such as approaches, trenches, counter-approaches, batteries, etc. And every step which this action of the higher faculties took was marked by some such result. It was only the thread that was required on which to string these material inventions in order. As the intellect can hardly manifest itself in this kind of war, except in such things, so therefore nearly all that was necessary was done in that way. So, another very short paragraph, nevertheless very important. So, in the previous one, we have seen how the first conception of the art of war was merely the preparation of the armed forces, right? Von Clausewitz introduces this historical perspective for which we see that in one time we can identify roughly as pre-modern warfare. The art of war, or what was defined in this way, at least at the point, was the merely preparation of the armed forces. That is to say that the main problem was really even being able to field fit troops for combat, right? And this was already a big deal, so there wasn't any great interest towards more developed theoretical systems about war, simply because objectively it was not the applicable possibility of, or the necessary possibility to apply such thoughts, right? You know, if you have limited resources and basically the greatest problem is mainly political, as always, you should start from there, and therefore the employment of the armed forces wasn't quite of a big deal. There was also a lot of homogeneity fundamentally between the armies, among the armies of the time. So this was not particularly important. In this paragraph, von Clausewitz instead starts talking about how the art of war, right, he has defined it in the first book, starts developing, and he says, in the art of sieges we first perceive a certain degree of guidance of the combat. So also in here, as we've said last time, it was a very progressive path, right? You can't even substantially identify the moment in which it changed from one side to the other, because the art of war practically has always existed in some form. It's just that it wasn't written down, right? We've seen before how in certain societies there wasn't even the problem of on how to, you know, to make a theoretical system of war, because people were already into it fundamentally. If you were a professional war, like a knight during the Middle Ages, you were already raised in that way, and what truly mattered was direct experience more than kind of theoretical system to eventually apply to make a difference, right? So here, and we have been talking about this intensely last time, so I just repeated it briefly, is not to say that in pre-modern times, being there not an art of war, warfare was unsophisticated, right? Even if you look at medieval warfare, it was one of the most dramatically sophisticated warfare ever, like possible at that point. There is no point in stating that it wasn't it was something simple or ineffective or primitive or inferior, right? It has to be contextualized, and you have to understand the limits and the boundaries within certain actions where possible. So, right, even investing resources at that point into a theoretical system would have been counterproductive. It was better to, you know, to spend them to equip another bunch of crossbowmen and training more knights, you know, and convincing them to go to war. Actually, it was always the first point at the end of the story, and it would remain also later. So it's in this state of things that we can start tracking from within the same Middle Ages. Here, von Clausewitz is very fascinating because it doesn't point directly at one era, right? He remains in general terms, because he wants us to understand really the concept, not when or how to make a kind of a list or a classification or a ranking, let's say, of placement of the various eras and where this began or that ended, and to make it want to be a more practical criticism, a more in fact historically rooted statement, you could say objectively that this first perception of a certain degree of guidance of the combat is to be identified in several, if you talk about modern warfare, of course this started within the Middle Ages. Of course there had been some sort of regression in some terms during the early Middle Ages. In ancient warfare had seen something similar, but not even ancient warfare basically fits into what here the art of war is narrowly defined. So that if you look at the development of trebuchet and the first firearms, you already understand it was a big deal of investment in these systems, and the obvious necessity of starting to think on how to employ them, right? Theoretically, not just let's do this for fun, or how it comes and see there are things that are simple to have just because you can use them and you don't have to worry about that. Well, there is something more than that, and in these terms you understand that really the art of war laid into these niches of practical warfare in every historical time. So it was just something that had to be developed, to be brought a step forward, because of the applicability of these notions fundamentally, and not much else. So there is this perception. It's also interesting that von Clausewitz puts it in these terms. It's that as far as we know, we can start to identify this as a certain degree of guidance of the combat. Right, and this highlights better the concept that we just expressed, because it's a guidance of the combat, right? The idea that you have to start thinking how to do it, starting theorizing a little bit about that, and not just thinking that there is that guy that is competent and that will do its work, but trying to think it a bit more. Not it's important here, not really abstractly, but theoretically, right? So in a way that it can work, in a way that other people can learn from it a bit, also not just through direct experience. So always giving that direct experience is always the most effective teacher, right? So and here von Clausewitz defines this incipient art of war emerging as something of the action of the intellectual faculties upon the material forces placed under their control. This is particularly important. We have seen in the previous paragraph how von Clausewitz highlighted this pre-existing moment to the development of the art of war as a merely materially oriented thing. Right, people were trained habitually to fight in a certain satisfactory fashion, either by society, by how it was something spontaneous largely. The only problem was really preparing and to the mode of using arms, the construction of fortifications and entrenchments, the organism of an army, the mechanism of its movements, right? And it didn't go far beyond that. That is to say, okay, we have to make this thing work, but then how you're going to use it is wholly another matter. So there are very mechanical, material problems, right? All the logistics and how you have to make an army move, and how to arm it, how to supply it, and so on, and to have that guy on the field that has at least a spear and a shield that can be employed, right? And that you rely on his more or less spontaneous abilities of fighting that society has, politics and society has given to him. So in here there is something different that plays upon the material forces, right? So there is an interest also in here that is true, that emerged during the Renaissance towards mechanics largely, right? It wasn't in this sense just an interest towards the, say, the moral side of the story. It was really about let's build things that work, that can in some perspective extend human power through this new tools, these new instruments and weaponry and so on. So this developed and let's say mostly in fact at that point. Von Clausewitz goes on by stressing, by the way, here that this intellectual faculties put the material forces under their control, right? So this is also an important conceptual passage. It's the idea that there is an intellect now to whom it's tributed a higher understanding on how to use the material forces. So something that goes beyond, that starts detaching itself timidly at the beginning, but necessarily and incessantly from the mere material side of the story, that can theoretically lead an army that starts posing itself, let's say, better the problem of how to lead an army without actually doing it. And there's an important difference. It's a really important difference. And always remember that we live in a world in which like 90% of us are theoretically oriented, because we have been taught like this in school, etc. Up to 100 years ago, like it was the reverse. There was just a 10% of people who were trained and educated into theoretical thinking. Most of the people were just pragmatically oriented, which means in practice that they weren't capable of reasoning by abstraction, right? If you had asked them, imagine this thing that you've never seen, for example, and this person would say not only, well, I can't say it because I've never seen it, but also what's the point of doing it, right? For us today, it's very easy instead to imagine something completely out of the blue and starting reflecting around it, right? So you can imagine and this was the beginning of the 20th century. Just imagine what it could be, in fact, in the 15th century, where this thing started effectively to change, right? So it's as if today we couldn't do without theoretical thinking, but at that time it's as if they couldn't do without practical thinking. And it was so normal that it was nobody cared about that, and that's why the also the positivistic approach to this interpretation is wrong, because that world needed people who thought only practically speaking. So no wonder there was kind of no theoretical problem posed in those terms, right? The world functioned well the way it did. It wasn't an underdeveloped stage of civilization, right? It was the best civilization it could be at the time, given those particular contexts. Also maybe this is also kind of a positivistic statement. I'm not saying that civilization, there is, from a moral point of view, there is always something better that can be done. But if you look at the pattern how civilization evolves throughout history, you realize that there is this minimal, this economical thought fundamentally of efficiency, of balance, that is achieving the maximum result with the minimal means, right? So for that world, there are certain things that evolved by themselves largely, and this is particularly important. So in the same way, we have to approach that. We should make the effort of approaching that world in reverse, right? And only then we can understand how this theoretical thinking starts appearing, and because it was necessary to new problems that were being posed. Always remember that this is the moment in which there is a centralized direction that starts emerging, right? The modern state starts making its first steps. So regarding this, you have to think, in fact, the directing problem, right? Of control. That's why von Clausewitz has just said the intellectual faculties that have to be controlled, that have to control the material forces, because there is really a need for bureaucrats and scientists and thinkers and diplomats and people who have to play, in fact, in this higher level of theory that before was not required, because before you called all your feudatories to make an army and stick together and hoping they would stick together. That was enough, and that's also what you had to play on if you wanted to win against an enemy, for example. The surplus was not enough to produce more means that you could employ to outreach the enemy capabilities, because material culture was practically homogeneous everywhere, and the main thing was like splitting the allegiance, the alliances, and this unity of the army, naturally playing on the field, also incompetent factors like attrition, etc. And it's important that von Clausewitz highlights that the true war first appears in the art of sieges, right? Because sieges were actually one of the basically most important problem in the warfare of the time. Like today we think mostly about armies and pitched battles because they look cool, and they look in fact more like the theoretical abstraction that we need as modern people. This idea that there were new battles that were in the modern warfare started appearing finally with armies, and they were so large and fought regularly in open fields. Not the Middle Ages, it was all about castles. Well, yeah, because in the Middle Ages there was no technology to surpass those castles. What is happening right now is that through the perfection of firearms, this is rendered possible. So what happens, among the other things, is that all these castles become largely useless. So this increases by far the speed and the range of armies, right? From a strategical point of view. And this accelerates brutally war. So you need now more troops that have to be put together in one place, while, for example, before firearms, just a castle with a garrison of a few tens of people could hold an army of thousands of men, like for entire months, and there was literally no single damn thing that army could do in order to surpass that material problem, right? So that it was easier most of the times actually to corrupt the garrisons, or wearing them down, rather than assaulting those fortresses, because there was no way to pass it, and that was a massive problem. Like it wasn't a sleeping Middle Ages that was stuck to castles. They were castles that really stuck the forces of medieval warfare, right? So it's way different, more different than that, and it's obvious that in this history of the art of sieges, you can, as we were saying before, put also the in fact the development of castles from even the 12th century, like when Europeans start to build more and more stone castles, for example, and larger fortifications, and that also in fact went in parallel with the creation of feudal monarchies and a bit more of a theoretical production, right? So actually we have to, probably von Clausewitz is as an extremely refined military historian, writes actually having in mind this concept, right? It was not just about firearms, it was something that started before, right? And it was a matter of thinking of, and in fact this is really a transtemporal concept. Like von Clausewitz here doesn't talk about really a specific chronological line. He's simply stating that in certain moments in history was like that, and then there was something else that obviously by his times in the 19th century things were, had headed far beyond that, and that therefore allowed this distinction. But otherwise, there is no stigma in here. You can put the period or another. It's really the natural, let's say, development of these transformations. And here from Clausewitz, in fact, by underlining the progressivity of this process, says, but generally only so far that it very soon embodied itself again in new material forms, such as approaches, trenches, counter-approaches, batteries, etc. Right? So what von Clausewitz is saying here is that, albeit the theoretical thinking was somewhat developing in this sense and in this direction, there was still a fundamentally an attention towards material things. It was about, yes, using those material things in a kind of a more in combination, right? And it still developed, in this sense, however, from a material point of view, right? It wasn't about creating something conceptually revolutionary, right? Even if you look at the Traces Italiennes and the development of Renaissance military engineering, you see that concepts are not so dramatically changing. Like, it's a massive change for the time, of course. It's enormous. It's something that blew these people's mind by certain standards. They perceived the change. Much of what we think, in fact, like of modernity, starts recognizing itself already at the time in that fashion. But it still revolves on things that basically already existed. If you talk about this approaches, counter-approaches, trenches, batteries, you don't actually add anything excessively different from what existed before. Like, yeah, you could start increasing and developing these new designs of fortresses, introducing mathematical geometrical proportions, and studying ballistics and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, what you had to build was something that already existed before. Even cannons, right? It took forever before even modern artillery was somewhat standardized. Medieval warfare, in this sense, by certain degree, extended up to, very far in time, and through, detachment of this theoretical vision of warfare would take a lot of time. In fact, it's really with von Clausewitz that it achieved its apex, right? It achieved the maximum purpose. So it's a path, it's a process where you have, in fact, to understand also military, in strictly military historical terms, that certain things never quite changed. Like, we like to think that there was something constitutively different between medieval warfare, modern warfare, contemporary warfare, and that's also why so many people have difficulties to understand von Clausewitz, because they assume that even just by talking from the 19th century, von Clausewitz, for example, couldn't be applied for 21st century warfare, which is basically having understood nothing from top to bottom about the Vom Kriege, right? And it's something that that is really heartbreaking in many ways, because von Clausewitz has this ability of covering the whole spectrum of what the conceptual objectivity of war is, independently from any age, right? It's this illness that modern people have, that they have to presume that they're always at the top of something, that they are somewhat better, they're somewhat smarter, that they get it better than other people. If anything, what we're assisting to, also intellectually speaking, also in scientific production, is basically that we are losing instead this ability of vision about what surrounds us, that we hyper fragment our understanding of reality at the point that we're not capable of interpreting it anymore in a kind of a functional fashion, right? It's this idea that if a person studies, has to be somewhat completely smart person, but well, no. Very intelligent people may be very intelligent in their own field, but maybe they could be complete goats in others. It's so easy to see that every day because it happens with all of us. So instead of we should stop the hypocrisy of pretending that we are also nice because we live in a world that objectively provides us with the means to live in a somewhat satisfiable, let's say, satisfying, level that for which we can fake our, about our limits, about our errors, our misunderstandings, but it's really not very concrete. Studying von Clausewitz is understanding that the pressure that reality puts on us is what made truly things progress over time. And what we seem to be intrigued into today is just a kind of epiphenomenal dimension, right? We seem not to count the fact that there is a structure thanks to which we can produce certain things, that it's a structure that took really a lot of time to be built up, just like with hierarchies, with values, with ideas. It today everything is cheap, right? There is the idea you can learn everything in a few seconds, and that you don't need further effort, right? And this is wrong, and this is why reading and studying works like the Vom Kriege is so instructive, because it really shows you that you missed the point, the way it really is, right? So that there is really no pride in pretending to be more understanding than someone came before. This is particularly important because when we look, in fact, at at past historical times, like some sort of inferior times, right? So von Clausewitz, in this sense, is probably telling us that we should also look at past historical civilizations to say, okay, well, this may have lacked something that today we have developed, but those guys were struggling against much greater odds than the ones that we are used to, right? And that this increasing detachment from the theoretical side of the story, from the material side of the story through a theoretical speculation, is not truly a source of a real improvement, but it's the consequence of the improvement in itself. So the person who broke their backs to provide people with the means, for example, of studying, right? This is what happened during the Renaissance, right? And it's naturally, I don't want to make it so dark, of course, but progress is dark. Progress does stem from continuous failure, continuous difficulties, right? And we have it terribly easy today. Terribly easy. Today's life is literally the easiest life ever existed in all human history. And this is good, but not because we have now personally achieved something about this. It's because we come from a past that built it for us. And we made a terrible effort, so that even a person, in fact, from 100 years ago, if he or she had seen how we live like today, well, they would have told us, why aren't you studying forever? Why aren't you applying? Why aren't you, why do you stop in front of the stupid smartphones and just do nothing all the day long? Because at the end of the day, that's literally how it is, right? And I want to, of course, downsize the people who go obviously to work every day and etc. But let's be honest about it. 100 years ago, in what came before, we were much tougher lives, which people struggled much harder than we can ever imagine. So stop complaining, at least about it. Life is a pretty dramatic and difficult and terrible experience under many ways, but points of view. But that's exactly where you should concentrate, maybe on aspects that go beyond the usual complaints about I don't want to do this, I don't want to do that. Be thankful that you're alive in the first place, and then do something about it, right? So, well, besides this, which usual moralistic digressions of Schwerpunkt, I don't know how much you're pleased to hear, but I have to lengthen a little bit the video because when I have such short paragraphs to say, because my objective is really to talk about a certain amount of time every day, so that on average I can, more people listen to it. It's not only about that, because obviously these are concepts that I personally think are very important. So I would shut up if I didn't think that they were. But sometimes, I'm also pretty repetitive. If you have watched the Schwerpunkts, the Vom Kriege playlist here, it's more than 50 videos at this point. We covered 1/3 of the Vom Kriege. You understand, I get pretty often into these considerations because I'm starting realizing that objectively the Clausewitzian system is really applicable to much more than just war, right? It's really a scientifical, economical, philosophical, rational system, and that's what makes it really great. That it's not wishful thinking. It's not kind of an abstraction. It's really what truly matters. So you can learn so much. And von Clausewitz knew about this also because, as you know, as we've said many times, this book was intended to be read by a lot of first of all from civilians, actually, and that's actually what makes it so important, because at this time the book of the hour was the Principe de l'art de la guerre by Jomini. That was incidentally a civilian, actually was a banker. He went also to military environments anyways, but he was appreciated by lots of military men. Instead, von Clausewitz has this astonishing success among civilians because it really shakes you, in the measure in which it presents you with a real picture, right? And it doesn't give you the illusion that there is, in this sense, just a play you can use to abstract yourself from actual reality. That's why von Clausewitz is so deep, because it doesn't present a positivistic ideal of rationalizing reality in a way you can interpret it easily. It's still a rational system, but it shows you that what we know, obviously, today, by studying our mind, etc., that we are not rational at all, right? That we have like a tiny bit of reason that basically other animals do not have, but the rest we're just a mess, things we do without apparent logic, but even sometimes. So aside from this, reflect on von Clausewitz in general. So the way I would like to picture this idea of approaches, trenches, counter approaches, batteries, etc., is in fact like just an intensification of previous warfare, right? It's not that this is also very important in this concept. There is not just that the theoretical side of the story doesn't elevate itself from reality to lose track of it. These were thoughts that were developed in order to make reality working better, keeping track of it, or trying to formulate new systems, new solutions, right? So trenches, batteries, and stuff like that, and is constant addition, and it's a very progressive development. Take, in fact, the development of linear tactics, like it took literally 200 years before you pass from pikemen to musketeers fully, right? In the world modern warfare, in this sense, you can be seen as a sort of very progressive stage, and that was marked also by several setbacks, right? There were many experiments that failed, also clamorously, and therefore this was here. That's where you find the real struggle that brings the necessity for an art of war. Because given the means employed, there is a much more evident margin for mistake. Let's start considering progress actually as a mistake patching rather than as a growth towards the infinite, right? Progress derives from failure. All the greatest achievements of civilization are an achievement of failure, of misery, of death, of suffering, of blood, of people dead in most horrifying ways. That's how achievement happens. It's like with evolution. Evolution doesn't work because there is an autonomous thing that develops. We think like Darwin, not like Lamarck. Evolution happens and we exist not because there is a better place we have to arrive to, but because there are other people who didn't make it before us because they were unfit, and not unfit because they were either more or less stupid or more or less strong or whatever. They didn't make it because there is a random system that changes at one point, and either you have those characteristics to adapt and survive, either you're done, and there is no point to the story, right? So this is how it starts happening. I mean, when you have in your hands systems like squares of thousands of pikemen and artillery and firearms and so on, and you start seeing that certain changes, certain decisions at the level of command and planning, etc., really make the difference between thousands of people butchered down in the blink of an eye. Well, you start posing yourself the problem of how can I avoid that, and that's not just by practice, because otherwise other people would die. You start thinking something that can counter the enemy in this ground, intellectually speaking. And it's always been so, like in war, throughout all the history of military history, by norm, it's the more intelligent that wins, not the stronger one. Let's reject this myth that it's the stronger that wins. It's the more intelligent that wins. And that's why, in fact, we do have so many problems, even in picturing correctly certain changes in history, and we like this idea of the tiny. Let's say, well, there are difficult examples here to make, but tendentially we think that that brute force is all you need. But the point is that if you do not know how to rightly apply that force, you're nothing. And history has proven it basically every single literal time. And the mistake happens because we lack any depth and perspective generally about these topics. You think that force is something that exists, like suspended in the air, that this looks like that can be applied only in one way, right? This seems like the condition that von Clausewitz uses at the beginning of the first book to demonstrate ex absurdum, in fact, what a kind of metaphysical war would be, right? How do you think you apply your means in war? Just by saying, I'm strong, I have more tanks, I have more bombers. How do you think really war is fought? Is fought, by the way, and consider it's not even thought instead. Like the big difference is always made even outside the battlefield, right? But if you have followed the series up to now, you know what I'm talking about, don't you? So I like to see it as an acceleration, right? If you look at 15th century to 19th century technology, the things didn't, okay, up to the 18th century at least, they didn't really, surpass a certain dimension, right? It was always kind of the same side of the story with some improvement. Sometimes it was a pretty substantial one, but still something that worked in similar ways. So this tells you how slow sometimes this process happened. And von Clausewitz here has, and every step which this action of the higher faculties, so of intellect, took was marked by some such result, right? So it's an improvement that went step by step with these changes, right? It's normal because that's, in part, at the cognitive level, if you think about it, it's, there are certain things that can shake your mind, as the examples that we made before. Like, you don't remain indifferent to a defeat, right? This is not a staged play of people who play chess, right? Never think that that playing chess tells you anything about the war in the first place, or strategy, or whatever. Because I use the term strategy not because I'm conceptually, let's say, detaching it from the concept of war, but because many people still have such confusions, as a matter of fact. This is real war. This means that if you make a mistake, at best you die. At worst, your entire country, including your family and children, die. And there is all of this thing in the middle that naturally you can play on. And voice at the top has naturally this enormous responsibility. Von Clausewitz underlines it very, very, very well. The idea that the commanders are just a bunch of morons at the top who do not know what the true trooper really does every day on the battlefield. Well, aside from the fact that, of course, I don't wish anyone to be on a battlefield ever, but the point is that, first of all, those are being selected in order for their own capabilities, hopefully, right? Sometimes it's not so, historically speaking, but the concept is that with at the top, in our own societies, it's because it has some sort of function it has to perform well. And the psychological pressure that a commander has is overwhelming. In the same exact ability that he can, of taking action, right? The idea of making taking a decision that can make a difference between life and death, of loss of people, is something devastating, in fact, and it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop making screwed up. Sorry, no, there's no sorry. These are things that change the history of entire countries of the entire world, right? So you can't hide from that, right? So this sort of, I don't even know where it stems from. As prejudice is mainly political. It's certain sick interpretations of society and politics that are very ideological, and that's why also studying military history frees you a little bit of dogmatism and of irrationality. But there is a direct impact that disasters like the ones of a defeat make you face, and that you can't forget. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says it was only the thread that was required on which to string these material inventions in order. Right? So in other words, this taught over time to start building a system with all this knowledge, with all these reflections and experiences, etc., and trying to make it in fact functional, of course. This naturally, we could make a history of this during the 18th century. Indeed, there had been a pretty substantial development of these ideas. The 19th century is really when von Clausewitz writes and he achieves the top of this. So this is important because these systems are not mere theories. This is the thing that we have to stress. Like theory, these are theories that are practically oriented, right? These are things that, at least theoretically, have to be done in order to change what happens on the battlefield. This is very important when you read, for example, some military treatise of ages where this process had not fully developed. Sometimes you read stuff. We on Schwerpunkt we talked about this. We studied some Byzantine. We quoted at least some Byzantine treaty, or there are others also some idea, but it doesn't stop to the military side of the story, right? You can observe it also in politics, etc. Well, when you see something that to our mind seems pretty simplistic or naive or whatever, the chances are that you are misunderstanding that in its context, right? Writing a treaty, for example, in a certain courtly context, etc. It was not a matter of, how that corresponds to reality. That's a matter of sticking, for example, to a historiographical model to maintain, to produce a certain image of you, or to have to make some sort of propaganda, or making people, however, think in a certain direction, and stick in fact to models that at that point have maybe not even really to do with the reality of warfare, right? And that tells you that they weren't conceived as such, because if we have stressed before that the world was largely practically dominated, you have to understand why such treatises were written. They were written evidently for purposes that evidently weren't practical for that particular field of knowledge, but that were useful in some other way, in a very practical fashion, towards other directions. So, laughing at the ancients, thinking, "Oh, look at these guys, what they wrote, it's so ridiculous." Well, it's because fundamentally you don't understand what they were doing. So maybe you are the one was not understanding, and without naturally, I don't want to downsize the naivety of certain conceptions in general. Certain cultural and intellectual limits are pretty evident, but there might have not been different options at the time, right? Which doesn't really, many people use this as criticizing, morally speaking, like, this person was wrong, this person was bad. I think you can do it. I posed myself the problem back in the day, saying, what's the point of criticizing morally history? Well, the point is, many people do it, especially there is a certain political side of the aisle today that does it in order to counter certain other beliefs. And therefore, the people who hold those beliefs feel aggressed and sticking to those things. But if you really think of it devoid of prejudice, judging history morally is something very dangerous, yes, but it still can be done. The problem is that to what end? Like, what are you going to accomplish? And from my experience, studying history really is an enormous challenge. It's extremely difficult. way more difficult than what is usually thought, and it's not about knowing one thing rather than another, but trying to understand one thing rather than another. That's the real thing. History is not memory. It's really squeezing your brain, trying to understand what all the options are. So you may not arrive to the solution, but you would arrive to a stage in which you say, well, you know what? This is way more complicated than I thought. So even moral judgments in that point are like, I mean, it's obvious that these people were conceptually, let's say, they had definitely different moral values and different standards in general that we can find bizarre, but it's still a world that has produced that. So pretending that it's kind of a lower quality world is, to which standards exactly? Because if you reason in this way, you can easily understand that in 1,000 years, people will think, if they will still exist, actually, the same exact thing about us, and therefore it's also often answering this problem at your own personal level that can solve part of the problem, right? Trying really to understand yourself first, and then trying to venture in judging, because I can tell you that when you study history seriously, you don't even have time to judge. That's the real point, because it doesn't help you. It helps you to put yourself into to doubt, right? And sometimes, and that's what the difficulty of history is, that many people will acclaim your results, maybe, because they don't understand at which depth you have arrived, what are the problems at that point, and already what you say seems amazing to them. Sometimes it's really a trick, like knowledge is a trick objectively, and it a lot of stays also in the ability in which you are able to sell yourself, and the way you can present yourself even without knowing sometimes, or without fully understanding. And this happens to all of us. There is not a single person in the world that doesn't do it, and it's usually the person who least does this that pretends to be some kind of pure soul, and that it's just like a naive soul at best. But there are many problems in this sense that maybe we'll talk about it another time. But I thought to include these ideas into a von Clausewitz video, because they have to do objectively in this specific topics, with the way you have to set the basis in order to think what von Clausewitz is telling you. Because von Clausewitz obviously is a man of the 19th century. He has all its own beliefs that and that's where the point is that it doesn't make you, they do not appear in here. Like, this is not a word, this is probably one of the most neutral things you can read ever. This is a neutral system. It has nothing within itself of ideological, right? There is a bit of criticism towards those who, in fact, had those positivistic approaches, but, who doesn't, actually. I perfectly agree with him, but it doesn't get into the system in itself. I mean, it's just a precondition to make you aware about the fact that there are certain kind of stupid things. And remember, von Clausewitz is not so obvious. Like, you have really to, in fact, to dig into his prose in order to fully understand what he's talking about. Because otherwise you could equivocate. Like, look at this title. True war first appears in the art of sieges. Now imagine someone who wants to quote von Clausewitz without having followed what we have followed up to now, and saying, this is, von Clausewitz thinks that everything that was like before the Renaissance was not true war. This is not what he wanted to say at all. At all. So that's why this book, like this work, should be studied and not just read. Because it must be understood, and that requires a lot of time. And otherwise, you just read the surface, but you don't get into at the core of the concept, and therefore you miss everything completely. And we've seen many times how if you miss one step in here, everything crumbles, right? So you can't make relativism of these concepts, right? Okay, so yeah, and von Clausewitz then says, in conclusion, as the intellect can hardly manifest itself in this kind of war, except in such things, so therefore nearly all that was necessary was done in that way. So what he has said, actually I didn't underline in the previous phrase, is that in fact much of these changes start appearing in this phase of history still were largely about what it was like before, right? So that's why you never have to be tricked by the idea of modernity as a qualitative change. Much of the modern age, still Middle Ages actually. It's very important to even to distinguish, by the way, the elite from the rest of reality. Like modern thought emerges not from a widespread vision of reality. Like the vision of reality at the time was largely, what difference is there between a peasant of the 14th century, a peasant of the 16th, of the 17th century? I mean, yeah, sure, there were differences, but let's be honest about it. Like 95%, it was basically the same thing. Or maybe I'm being too excessive, but peasantry existed. I mean, the serfs existed in Europe up to the last century. I mean, what the concept is that let's say the Renaissance has portrayed itself from an elite base, right? This could have gone differently, objectively. There were some important changes in medieval history brought to this direction instead than another. So what von Clausewitz is stressing here is that this improvement only started from kind of an intensification of the these material problems, right? So he says, intellect at this point was still largely non-used in the way we do today, right? So that this was a very progressive thing that started in some measure that at that point, as we have seen, can't even be tracked precisely or quantified precisely. It was very narrow, but it still was developing step by step. What else to say? I think these concepts are very important in general in order to form a solid strategic or tactical culture and a clear theory, right? Because that's the problem with war, is that there is a lot of things that have to be understood before than just said or read, or and there is let's say a big side of the story that has to do with experience, but also what you can in fact communicate about experience, right? It's the problem from Clausewitz will also address about what's the relation between the theory of war and in fact how to carry out a military operation. I mean, that's a real problem, and there are different consequences from the both of them, but still we need both. So you can't really do without at one point in history, especially, and especially today, because the problem is that war is all around us in a way that it does influence us. So we can't say, this is they just leave this to the military. It's a political problem. It's not a, it's it's where everything starts from policy. We have seen it with von Clausewitz. That's basically the most important concept in what the word Clausewitz in theory. At the end of the day, at least in terms of practical applications, because this is what von Clausewitz is interested in. Always remember this: von Clausewitz doesn't write for the sake of creating, castles in the air. He is really talking to the core of your understanding capability in order to make you understand the connection that exists between our mind and the reality that surrounds us in a way that can make things work for real, right? So it's important that, in the sense, von Clausewitz was also a man of the 19th century, because he was closer to that, albeit being a brilliant theoretical mind, but he also knew what he was talking about in practical terms, right? And also by massive, literally massive, enormous direct experience about what war was as a from a soldier, as a commander. Von Clausewitz was through like the largest conflict that had ever happened, historically speaking, up to that point, and so it's important to locate correctly also this work, historically speaking, because that spares you from poor misunderstandings of also what the Vom Kriege is meant to be and what its potential is. And we could really talk endlessly about von Clausewitz for forever. Like, I think it's one of the most fascinating topics in absolute terms. But for this reason, this is not just a mere speculation. It's really about improving our world through this knowledge. And we still don't care, because who does know von Clausewitz today? I mean, for real, I guess I don't want to know really the statistics about, how many people have even heard about him. But important is not how much you have heard or not about him. It's rather what do you understand about him, right? Which is a totally different thing. So I'm always been fine with ignorance. The real problem is when you go beyond ignorance and you start basically talking about things that you do not know, or that you pretend to know without knowing them. And that's not ignorance, that's stupidity, which is far worse, because being stupid is not lacking intelligence, because that is a common problem to all of us. Being stupid is having intelligence, is not using it. That's the worst. In fact, there is no worse stupid than he who does not want to understand. That's the real problem, right? Alright, I could add more to this, like understanding to be in this condition is also probably very difficult, because as long as you do not really see things, you can't quite even behave as if they were there. So that's why you make the worst mistake, but this is often not explainable to someone who hasn't got the direct experience of that. So that's why listening to these perspectives is important, because at least kind of prepares you for when you will get to that point, hopefully, and you will finally understand, and you will know how to handle problems in life, etc., in a kind of a functional fashion. It's a never-ending process. There's no point of arrival. You can just do your best and hoping that this will work, because sometimes this is also what the the Vom Kriege teaches us brutally is that, you know, you can even be the best, but you can fail as badly as anyone else, right? So it's yeah. And on this kind of depressing note, but quite realistic one at least, we stop. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.